So since their inception, the social sciences have been engaged in what's sometimes called the Methodenstreit, the methodological dispute. The earliest or most, perhaps the most celebrated version of this happened in the 1880s with a bunch of German-speaking economists. On one hand, there was the Austrian school represented by Menger, who thought that economics should be a hard science and should follow the methodology of the natural sciences. And on the other side was the German historical school, Schmuller, who thought that economics should be more humanistic. And of course, this battle continues into the present with things like quants and quals and so on and so forth. And our beloved Bob has intervened on this debate, as we even heard a little bit about this yesterday with things like hermeneutic exclusivism and interactionism and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to kick the tires on the way that Bob sort of intervenes on the Methodenstreit. And because underneath this pleasant exterior, there's a simmering narcissism, this is really going to be, as Pascal already pointed out, right? Not just about Bob, but also about me. All right, so plan of attack is I'll start off with some McCauley meditations where I sort of talk you through Bob's conception of the Methodenstreit. I'll highlight some ambiguities as Pascal did. So thanks for setting the stage so I don't feel like the cranky philosopher who's correcting Bob. And then what I'm going to suggest is an unexplored option, what I'm going to call explanatory inclusivism that falls out of a slightly regimented conceptualization of the Methodenstreit based on Bob's work. I know I'm supposed to stand still. I'm going to fail. I'm sorry. I'm just going to tell you that now. Yeah. So I'll I'm going to say there's an unexplored option, explanatory inclusivism, and give an initial pitch for it, and end actually with some questions where I'm hoping you guys can help me figure out if this is better than just an initial pitch. All right, so we're going to start with some McCauley meditations. Okay? And in particular, what I want to do is just start off by clarifying some key terms. So when I use the word interpretation, I take that to be the use of folk psychological concepts, mostly mental states like beliefs, desires, intentions, plans, to make sense of, account for, understand human action. Right? Now, the contents of those beliefs and desires and so on and so forth are what we typically call meanings. Right? And so that's what I take interpretation to be. Okay. I'm going to take explanation to be basically the embedding of the uncovering of a phenomenon's causal structure. For those of you who have maybe some different conceptions of causation, this doesn't require strict laws. I'm mostly thinking about this in terms of supporting counterfactuals and things like that. And for those of you who have been following my career, this is a very, very constrained notion of explanation. I'm sort of a rabid explanatory pluralist, but this is all I'll need for today. Okay, and with that, we can start to see how Bob carves up the landscape. So he has four positions, right? The first of which is explanatory exclusivism, which holds that the human sciences should provide explanations, but not interpretations, right? And roughly the idea here is, right, the natural sciences traffic in explanations. The natural sciences are mature. The human sciences should be mature, right? That's the impulse behind that. But of course, we lose a lot when we eschew interpretation entirely from the human sciences. So that's the problem with that, rightfully rejected. Right? I'm not going to spend too much time on the exclusivist positions. We all know why they're horrible, right? Hermeneutical exclusivism just flips the script, right? It says, look, humans are so special, right? They have this rich inner life that things like rocks and quarks and stuff like that don't have, right? So of course we need a special method for making sense of this. We need interpretation, right? Explanation really misses the point, right? And of course, that's also a very impoverished view. And we've heard some very trenchant critiques of hermeneutical exclusivism yesterday. Here's where I think things start to get interesting, right? There's hermeneutical inclusivism, right? Which in slogan form is the idea that both interpretation and explanation should play a role in the human sciences, right? But somehow explanations are subordinate to interpretations, right? And mostly what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of suggest that there might be a few different notions of subordination in play in Bob's work, right? So I'm going to fast forward. There's a bunch of different iterations of hermeneutical inclusivism in Bob's work. Also, I'm sorry, Tom, I'm omitting you, but that's only because I'm going to criticize Bob and I don't want to criticize you. I think the most sophisticated form of interpretive or hermeneutical inclusivism is one that was actually inspired by another one of my teachers at Emory, the late Rudolph McCreel. And here's how Bob and Tom characterize that view. I thought this was a particularly pithy and direct statement. So it says, interpretive endeavors set the agenda for any explanatory excursions we may make in our attempts to account for human behavior. And that's basically the basis for subordination, right? So it ends up being a sort of means-end subordination, right? Roughly is the idea. So in a slightly more compact statement, I'm going to express that as follows, right? In the human sciences, explanations are only a means to interpretive understanding, okay? Now, there are lots of problems with this, but mostly what I want to just sort of capture is this is characterizing the means, the subordination relationship in terms of means and ends, right? So then we get to interactionism, right? And the idea is, okay, like inclusivism, both explanation and interpretation are at the table, right, in the human sciences, right? However, right, it's an equal partnership. And so if we sort of took our cue from that characterization of inclusivism I just gave you, you might then think, right, that we should characterize interactionism this way. I'll call this means-ends interactionism. In the human sciences, explanations are a means to interpretive understanding, but also interpretations are a means to explanatory understanding, would be the thought. However, I don't think this is what Bob is up to, right? And I'll try to explain why, right? So here's a representative quote. And I've sort of highlighted it. You don't need to read through this whole quote. There's just two things I want you to glean from this. The first, and this is sort of an aside, right? There's a lot of emphasis on novel interpretations and novel explanations. Note that that wasn't any part of interpretive inclusivism, right? So this is already a sign that maybe we're starting to talk about different things. I think this is a minor concern. The bigger one are the red words, right? These are all the relationships between explanations and interpretations. Note that some of them lend themselves to a means-ends reading, like utilizing and facilitating. Some of them are a little bit less clear, right? Like requiring and informing, right? But what I want to suggest is when you actually look at the arguments that Bob raises against interpretive inclusivism, it's clear that he actually isn't up to a means-ends interactionism. And I'll just give you a sense of this. So I take this to be the central critique that he raises against Rudy's brand of interpretive inclusivism, right? He says, the production of new meaning assumes a great deal of background knowledge. That background knowledge is largely, or has a large explanatory component to it. And then here's the crucial bit, is that last sentence, right? Consequently, the hermeneutical process presupposes in part what it allegedly subordinates. And I take it the implicature there is that hence there's something wrong with the subordination narrative, right? The argument then would look something like this, right? Interpretation presupposes explanation. And I take it the general principle has to be something like, if X presupposes Y, then Y is not a means to X, if we're buying the means ends interactionist reading of this. And so then it would be that explanation is not a means to interpretation. But I think there are two reasons that this can't be what Bob is up to, right? So the first, right, is that the conclusion would be utterly unwelcome, right, if you're a means ends interactionist, right? Of course, you want to say that explanation can be a means to interpretation, right? So I don't think that's right. Second, I think it's obvious that this premise is false, right? So let me just give you an easy example, right? Music presupposes sound, right? But sound is very clearly a means to making music, right? So it's pretty clear that premise 2 can't be right either. So I'm not going to saddle Bob with this dumb interpretation, right? Here's what I think is going on. I think that premise 2 is basically sort of a stipulation or a partial definition of what he means by subordination, right? That really, and so as a result, what he's actually concerned with is what I'm going to call presuppositional interactionism, right? So there's two things I want to note about this. The first is there's an interesting consequence of premise 2, which is note that mastery presupposes slavery, therefore slaves are not subordinate to masters. So I want to out Bob as a hidden fanboy of Hegelian dialectics, right? The second is that presuppositional interactionism, which I'll state sort of precisely here, right? Seems like a very plausible position, and I'm going to grant that, right? In the human sciences, interpretations presuppose explanations, and explanations presuppose interpretations, right? But I have this nagging worry, right? Which is the means ends question seems really interesting to me. And at least in my heart of hearts, partly because I don't think Bob is an Hegelian, I think that there might be something to that notion of subordination that's worth taking seriously and exploring. And so what I'm going to suggest is there's an unexplored option, right, which might be a good answer to this. And I want to suggest actually that you should be a presuppositional interactionist but I want to suggest that perhaps we should be, when it comes to means ends questions, we should be explanatory inclusivists. And I'll just say, yesterday, as I heard people talk, it felt to me like you guys were explanatory inclusivists when it came to means ends kinds of questions. Right? So here's the thesis, right? In the human sciences, interpretations are only a means to explanatory understanding, right? I could say a lot more about what I mean by explanatory understanding, but roughly it's the uncovering of causes of a phenomenon, right? So what I'll do now is sort of highlight three initial attractions of explanatory inclusivism, right? The first one is that it fits well, I think, with canonical human sciences. So I'll talk you through one of my favorite examples, right? Which is headhunting amongst the Ilonggo, right? So the Ilonggo are a group of people in the Philippines, and up until the 1970s, they engaged in headhunting. And the history of ethnography around the Ilonggo is quite interesting. And I think it's, I hope you'll see it as a canonical case of interpretive human science, right? So let's start in 1980. Renato Rosaldo wrote a really lovely ethnography of Ilonggo headhunting. It's pretty meat and potatoes ethnography. There's nothing fantastic going on, no postmodern fireworks or anything like that. And he noticed sort of two things about headhunting that he thought were quite interesting. That life stages actually make a significant difference to your reasons for taking a head, right? So if you're a youth, right, it's essentially a rite of passage, right? But if you're an older Ilonggo man who's already taken a head, the reasons for taking a second head are a little bit less clear, even by his own admission in this 1980 book, right? They say things like, by taking a head, I unburden myself of my grief, right? Which seems very puzzling. And he conjectures about what might be going on, right? Now, something tragic happens in 1981, right? Renato's wife, Michelle Rosaldo, an excellent anthropologist in her own right, is doing fieldwork in the Philippines and tragically falls to her death, right? Renato remains quiet for a while, right? But then in 1984, he writes, I think, one of the most beautiful pieces of writing I've seen in anthropology, called Grief and a Headhunter's Rage on the Cultural Force of Emotions. And I choose this one because I do think it's a really clear case where he's engaging in interpretive human sciences. And so I hope the lessons I draw from this are somewhat representative, right? So I'm just going to quote at length here. He says, if you ask an older Ilonggo man of northern Luzon, Philippines, why he cuts off human heads, his answer is a one-liner. He says that rage, born of grief, impels him to kill his fellow human beings. The act of severing and tossing away the victim's head enables him, he says, to vent and hopefully throw away the anger of his bereavement. He continues, for years, I had thought that more verbal elaboration, which was not forthcoming, or another analytical level, which remained elusive, could better explain the kinds of things these older men, when enraged by grief, can do to their fellow human beings. It was not until I was repositioned through lived experience that I became better able to grasp that Ilonggo men, older men, mean precisely what they say when they describe the anger and bereavement as the source of their desire to cut off human heads. Right? So note that he takes himself to be engaging in an explanatory endeavor, right? I think the word explanation and its cognates show up like a dozen times in this very short article. And what I want to do now is sort of talk you through an interesting process that I think is going on here, because I think it'll illustrate why I think explanatory inclusivism is the right way to interpret this, right? So what is Rosaldo doing? Well, he's trying to make sense of a human action, in this case, Ilonggo headhunting, right? First thing he does is he imagines himself, right, in those same circumstances performing that action, right? The next thing he does is he basically simulates or imagines what reasons or emotional states he would have that would be a good reason for engaging in that, and that's rage and grief, right? And the final thing he does is he projects that back onto the Ilonggo men, right? And I highlight this because what you're going to see is this is a pattern that actually is robust across many sciences, right? Once we see the general pattern, right? So I take it if interpretations are not merely a means to an end, we might think at this point the story is done. And an interesting data point is arguably Rosaldo thought that the work was done at this point, right? But of course, science is a social enterprise, right? And other anthropologists had some thoughts about this. And what I want to suggest is the final verdict is really that this is not a correct explanation of Ilonggo headhunting, but merely a possible explanation, right? An explanatory hypothesis. But what makes it particularly useful right? And I think this is the way in which it's serving as a means to explanation, is it stages itself well. I talk about explanatory staging in one of my other works, right? And very roughly what that means is there's ways of conceptualizing explanations that make them amenable to empirical testing, right? So what's particularly striking about this case is how he sort of basically dismisses, right, all other sorts of explanations as actually having a role, right? Essentially what he's saying is raging grief is a sufficient cause for headhunting, right? Which is a strong, bold, testable hypothesis, right? So hopefully it's sort of warming, right, Bob's Popperian heart that he's doing this, right? And it turns out that this is a bold, testable hypothesis, and it failed, right? So here's a brief summary from Andrew Beattie, doing a review article on emotions, the anthropology of emotions. And I think you get a sense of some of the deficits that arise with Rosaldo's explanation from this. He says, in Rosaldo's case, the argument from experience is spoiled by the fact that in crucial respects, the headhunter's rage is conventional, sparked by rhetoric and reheated in fireside tellings. I'm telling you, these anthropologists write so much more beautifully than philosophers, right? The hunters themselves may not be among the close kin of the dead, and the act of retribution may take place years after the death, long after tempers have cooled. Add to this, the motivation for raiding is linked to culturally specific ideas of prestige and manhood, and we are forced to conclude that the points in common with the grieving anthropologist are small, the brute facts of death and immediate grief. This is too little on which to build an explanation of headhunting. Right? So I take it what we see here, right, is engaging in these sorts of interpretive methods like perspective taking in this particular case, right, do play a role, right, in the human sciences, but they're just a means to testing out explanations, to figuring out what's going on, right? I'll turn to the second attraction, right? These are just sales pitches. This is not a conclusive argument, just to be clear, right? It's what I call the idle reason argument. So one of I think the boldest claim of explanatory inclusivism is that this is the only role for interpretations to play, right? So what I want to try and do is motivate this a little bit more, right? So here's the general structure of an idle reason, right? You have an interpretation which isn't causally efficacious, but somehow is still important, and maybe something else is then causing the action, right? And note that this happens. To some extent, this might be Beattie's criticism of Rosaldo, but we see this all the time when people talk about bad faith amongst the people they're studying, or false consciousness, right, or confabulation, right? These are all things that can actually be occurring, right, within the framework of interpretive social science. Right? So this is a genuine phenomenon. And then the one thing I want to point out is, how do we actually know, right, when we're in an idle reason situation, right? And I think you can't do this except, right, if interpretations are basically a means to explanation, right? And I'll explain why, right? So let's do a slightly stylized version of Rosaldo's case, where we want to say raging grief is an idle reason, right? So what would we need to do? Well, presumably we need to find a case, right, where there's no raging grief, right, and whatever this other factor X is still obtains, and we still see headhunting, right? And conversely, right, what we're going to need to do is find cases where raging grief is present and X is absent, and see no headhunting, right? But what are we doing here? We're just performing a natural experiment. We're just applying Mill's methods, right? This is just a simple form of causal inference, right? Exactly right, according to my view, right? So do you want to know what the role of an idle reason is? It's a covariate, right? That's essentially the story I want to tell, right? So I think that there's a way in which this is supposed to be a very favorable situation, right, for someone who wants to deny explanatory inclusivism, right? A reason that isn't playing an explanatory role, and yet it's still playing an explanatory role. And it seems that the best way to know this is, in fact, right, by engaging in exactly the methods that are characteristic of explanatory activity. All right, third reason, and this is admittedly a little bit more tenuous, but it's just a fun example, so I want to talk about it. It features both Kim Kardashian and Richard Feynman. It highlights certain connections with the natural sciences. So let's start with Kim Kardashian. This is completely accidental. I'll explain why in a second. Right. So what I want to show you is there's a more general version of what Rosaldo is up to. Right. That's actually a very powerful heuristic across the sciences. Right. I'll call it perspective taking. I don't know if that's felicitous or not, but it's fine for my purposes. Right. So remember, Rosaldo started off and he's trying to make sense of why an entity, in that case a human, right, is exhibiting a particular behavior, in that case an action, headhunting, right? And I want to say, imagine that Kim's trying to figure out why a sphere is spinning, right? Well, she's going to do something very similar to what Rosaldo, or she can do something very similar to what Rosaldo's doing, right? She can imagine herself exhibiting the same behavior, right? In the same circumstances. So if you want to know, I found the spinning animated woman, and I thought to myself, well, who's a famous person with black hair? Right? And Kim Kardashian was the first person who came to mind. Okay, so she's put herself in the same situation, much as Rosaldo did when he was thinking about headhunting, right? Remember, Rosaldo then, right, thought, well, raging grief might be my reason for engaging in headhunting. And, you know, if you start thinking about how you spin in circles on a wooden floor, you might notice that you exhibit a fair amount of torque in your midsection, right? Right, so you've sort of posited an explanatory factor that's going on there, right? And then finally, of course, just as Rosaldo projected, right, raging grief back onto his Alongo subjects, right? Oh, all right, well, anyway, poor fronting and loading on that one. But anyway, Kardashian is projecting that torque back onto the midsection of the sphere, right? Note once again, this is only, there we go. It's only a possible explanation, right? But it also helps, it's well staged, right? I think to myself, well, if someone put their hand in my midsection, it would be a lot harder to spin. I can then think of an intervention, right, on the sphere, right? And so that's roughly the idea. Now I'll talk you through a real example involving Richard Feynman, right? So I've got headhunters, Kim Kardashian, and Richard Feynman. I'm pretty sure that that's the Trinity, but you guys can tell me if I'm wrong about that in a second, I guess. All right, so this is an example I've turned to a lot, actually. I think I first talked about it in the dissertation that Bob read. This occurs in the late 60s, early 70s, right when the standard model in particle physics is starting to sort of gain traction. So they're starting to get some really neat scattering results in Stanford. They don't quite yet know how to interpret them. There's a theorist at Stanford, not part of the experimental team, that's getting all these results, named James Bjorken, right? And he's cranking through some really complicated current algebra, right? And he says, oh, this data is interesting. He's like, can you plot these two curves for anybody? So one of his friends at the Stanford, well, more than one of his friends, several of his friends at the Stanford Linear Accelerator team, right, plot this data, right? And these are now known as Bjorken scaling curves, right? It's a striking early novel prediction, right, for the standard model, right? Problem, not even Bjorken's postdocs understand the model that he's using. There's like striking quotes about this. So in walks Richard Feynman from Caltech. He reads through Bjorken's paper. He looks at the experimental results. And what I want to suggest he does is he actually engages in perspective taking, right, of the sort that we just talked about. And it's useful precisely because of explanatory staging, right? So here are a couple of retellings from Michael Riordan, who was one of the experimental physicists at Stanford at the time, in a really nice book called The Hunting of the Quark, right? He says, Feynman looked at electron scattering not from the familiar perspective of a stationary proton target, but from the viewpoint of the onrushing electron probe, right? And he points out that this is essentially just a frame of reference kind of thought experiment, right? Made popular by Einstein, and he actually notes that affinity, right? So, but frame of reference kinds of thought experiments are going to be primed for exactly this kind of perspective taking and explanatory staging I'm talking about, right? He continues, right? Riding a speeding electron beam at relativistic velocities, Feynman could see the uprushing protons becoming flattened into thin pancakes, right? There's another move called impulse approximation, which Feynman also gives a kind of colorful gloss on, as he's prone to do. But if you peer into those thin pancakes, you'll see 3-point-like particles, right? Now, Feynman called them partons. We now call them quarks. Yep. Okay, so note that none of this stuff about pancakes, right, riding electrons and so on and so forth, right, is actually part of the explanation in any strong sense, but it's an effective means, right, for doing all sorts of things. And in particular, one thing to keep in mind is experimental physicists really know what to do when they know that there's one particle smashing into another, right? And that was really the insight of Feynman's perspective taking, right? There's the explanatory staging, right? Vindicated, right? And this interpretation of explanatory staging is vindicated by the fact that there were two roughly crucial experiments that they ran immediately after this, which knocked out competitors up to the standard model or the parton model at the time, right? Those are the vector meson dominance model and the Regge exchange model. Right. But crucially, just what I want to point out is perspective taking, generating explanatory as a means to explanatory staging, right, is something that happens across the sciences, and that's one of the nice virtues, right, of explanatory inclusivisms. It gives you a nice way of sort of keying in on this. Right? And with that, I'll wrap up. I should just say I'm still talking to my therapist about why I felt the need to activate all of Bob's chakras. But at any rate, here are sort of the three take-home points, right? Bob's characterization of the Methodenstreit could benefit from distinguishing between, I think, two kinds of relationships that you might be interested in with respect to interpretation and explanation. The first is presupposition, and the second is the means-ends relationship. I want to say that that interactionism works well with presuppositions. It's less clear that it works with means-ends relationships. And I also want to sort of make my initial pitch for explanatory inclusivism, where interpretations would be a mere means to explanations. And I'll just end with a few questions. Right? I've just looked at perspective taking. There's obviously a wealth of interpretive methods out there. Because of the specializations of the people out there, I'd be especially interested in knowing about other interpretive methods that are prominent in the study of religion and whether you can run the explanatory inclusivist line with those. Because we have a lot of people from the cognitive science of religion in particular, I'm interested in sort of success stories of explanatory inclusivism. But as Bob has taught me and as others have noted, right, I'm also looking for trouble, right? So if you have good counterexamples, I'd be interested in those as well. And finally, I'm going to end, I'm going to put a stupid, goofy thank you note because I'm trying my best to keep myself together for this part. But my navigation through explanation and interpretation is deeply personal. I came to Emory well schooled in quantitative social science and really eager to learn about hermeneutics because I felt that was a gap in my education. It turns out that when you spend a lot of time looking at diffie-Qs and regression tables, you kind of suck at reading Heidegger and Gadamer. And I felt a little lost here. And so my third year, I took philosophy of science with Bob. And it was my meal ticket. You know, you saved me. Thank you.
Question coming from the outside and really not knowing much, which means anything about these discussions. It struck me that when you talked about the difference between means ends and presuppositional sort of discussions, that a lot of the discussion you had at the beginning was about the sort of statics of statements. Some statements entail, presuppose, etc. And all the passages you had from Bob's stuff were about the dynamics of scientific progress, whereby it's not said that something entails something, but it suggests, it creates, etc. I don't know if these two distinctions are orthogonal or
Yes, good. So, oh, back to the mic. Yes. Sorry. This is so foreign to my way of doing talks. So yes, as you might have noticed. So yes, actually, I thought about adding another version of interactionism, which is what I might call generative interactionism. It's an interesting question. I think you're right. It gets murkier there. What I will point out is what I take to be, once again, the one of the arguments that I can sort of pin Bob down on very clearly is the critique of hermeneutical inclusivism, and it's not clear to me that it will make sense of that particular view as well. But I'll need to think about that as well, just because that one is very explicit about assumptions and presuppositions. But maybe if you give it a different reading where those are more generative or heuristic or something like that, it does work. I'll have to think about that. All right, so it's mostly right. Awesome.